Right away you get the impression of the leaf. So making a brown church on a dark blue sky is not a right choice. Remember that art and painting and watercolor are all interpretation of what you see, so you can make it white even if it's not, you can make it blue even if it's not, you can make it colorful even if it's dull. That's all your choice. Hi artist friend and watercolor lover, today I'm really happy to offer a watercolor tutorial in which I am going to share with you my 10 secret weapons to be more at ease with your watercolor. I assume in this video that you are maybe a beginner that struggle a bit with watercolor, especially with direct watercolor, which means probably without any pencil guidelines, just a brush straight on the paper, maybe trying to take on the 30 by 30 direct watercolor 2018 marathon. But if you are a more seasoned painter, feel free to watch the video and maybe you can get a few advices here and there and things that can help you keep improving your work nevertheless. But please don't be mad at me that I assume that you don't know this or that thing. In my teaching approach, I always prefer to assume that nobody knows anything so that I can try to explain it all from the roots, and that I am sure that everybody is understanding it all and is able to get the essence of the content. These advices and secret weapons are meant to help you to get more successful sketches right away, to be more at ease with watercolor, maybe just slightly a bit less scared about it, because sometimes watercolor can be a bit scary because it's unpredictable, and sometimes I'm a bit scared with it too, but most of the time I manage to be at ease with it and be confident with my painting approach and process, thanks to these few advices and tips that can help you to get on the right foot and have the approach that make it easier and more enjoyable. So this is a bit about making it easier in order to succeed, but don't think that it's a bit of a kind of a low-level approach, because starting easier and being confident will be the roots to anchor your process and your watercolor technique in order to bring it to the next level and to become a great, confident, wonderful painter, for sure. Let's get into the tip. First secret weapon is about choosing a freeform subject, especially a natural subject, that is more unforgiving than some others, kind of straight line, urban subject or others. For sure, this kind of subject can help you to get on the right foot and to have some nice practice and to get some successful sketches that will be really encouraging for you to take on other kind of subjects. And that's not even a sacrifice to make, because natural subject are so diverse and so amazing to paint. That's such a pleasure. And believe it or not, I didn't even wear this shell around my neck on purpose. It was just kind of a random creative thing that happened. So I have some plants to sketch. I brought some feathers, some I picked in Iceland, shells, leaves, flowers. I also have this old French book. I used to keep some fall leaves, all kind of thing, and just browsing it is so inspiring. So all kind of leaves. They lose a bit their color, but not so much. See, this one stayed quite bright. So this is a nice inspiration too for natural subject. I just put out a few in here. Look at these hydrangea flowers, just dried like that. I should paste this in my sketchbook, that's just so lovely. Some ferns to sketch for you, probably, and all of this. I was thinking, yeah, but this natural subject has some symmetry and they are quite regular, so they are not at all unforgiving subjects. That's not the case, and they are really unforgiving subjects, because we are not used to see always the leaves this angle, but they can grow that way, that way, that way. So with all the distortion, with the perspective, you can sketch a bit whatever you like. Gives you a lot of option to paint them. Second tip, and I am going to start painting really soon, is focus. So important. We too often tend to want to sketch it all and painting the whole thing, and we get overwhelmed, and usually the best sketch is not kind of big thing with too much things in it, but focusing on one or two subjects makes the best sketches. And before being able to paint a whole scene with I don't know how many ferns, you just need to know how to paint one. And if you watch my previous video when I am doing this painting, you can see with the montage as I show you how I sketch just one leaf after another to grow the whole sketch. So just start teaching yourself to paint one thing, maybe two, not too close, maybe even a bit separated, and this will be really easier for you to tackle more complex scenes afterwards. So painting natural, forgiving subject to make it easy and focusing on one or two things at a time is what I am going to do right now. But how are we going to paint these for real? I mean, practically, technically, we want real advice. Practical advice and secret weapon number 3 is start with simple silhouette. When I talk about silhouette, I mean just imagine that your subject is casting a shadow on your page and you are just going to paint this, which means that you have a kind of contour, an edge, and inside is just a kind of maybe plain surface, or anyway something without any details. If your subject has an interesting outer edge, this will get even more interesting, of course. So let's start painting this maple leaf, and so you want to ignore the nerves or the color variation, just picking one color, getting some juicy pigment, and just paint the shape by laying down the brush. And giving it shape without any details. Wonderful things with watercolor and with growing the wash like that is that you can always correct it while it's wet, for example in here, or if you want to have the impression of just of little tooth in here, you can just correct slightly your edge afterwards so that it gets a bit more the spirit of the subject, but once again just keep it simple. And what do you think? Doesn't this kind of simple sketch maybe the more striking and the more wonderful? You can in a second time drop some darker pigment in some places or some other color pigment to get more subtle thing and variations, but that's not even always necessary. Just a hint of something and that's it. This idea of a nice silhouette is important even for some more complex or other kind of subjects. For example, if I am in town or I want to paint some more urban scene, I always try to find a bell tower or a roof that has a nice silhouette shape, because once again I know I can simplify inside and melt in my washes, but I have a kind of edge and outline, contour, an interesting skyline to work with, so that my watercolor is going to be pretty even if some parts are really melted and really simplified. Still with this idea of painting a silhouette, sometimes you can make just a plain silhouette like I did and it works so wonderfully, and sometimes you can want to include a bit of detailing by keeping a bit of white here and there, and that's what I am going to show you right now, maybe with painting a feather. So to paint this feather, I don't want to paint a kind of a plain silhouette like this one, because there is this white line that is really strong in the middle, so I want to keep this white on the paper. Plus the texture of the feather are really important so that you can recognize the subject. It's going to be a bit my next tip too. So I'm going to play with a bit of texture and a few lines in my silhouette so that you can recognize a feather more easily. So I mixed some grey and I'm just starting to paint my silhouette, and then at some point I'm going to work with a more subtle silhouette while keeping this area in the middle, just a really thin white line. And about some more technical advices about how to make the edges and handle the brush, stay tuned for the following of the video, of course. And yeah, the line can be a bit broken, but just to give an impression of the direction. And I also talked about having this impression of feather by kind of breaking down a bit the silhouette here and there. I a bit forgot to do it at the top, but I can show you at the bottom. Trying not to get it too separated so the washes can be melted at some point. And then for the bottom of the feather, I can just keep the same color and making maybe it really light. We will talk about negative painting afterwards. But that way already you have the impression of the feather by sketching the silhouette, but just keeping a bit of detail inside. Be careful though about getting into some details or some texture too soon. I have this problem sometimes with my sketches, and I think that most of the time, or really often, just a kind of plain silhouette is nice, and sometimes you can add a bit of details afterwards when it's dry. So just add this bit of texture or details if you think that it's really nice to have kind of a white element, but don't do it all the time and on every part of your subject. Try to restrict a bit yourself. And this leads me to my fourth secret weapon, which is simplify getting the spirit of the subject. So what defines your subject? What is important? We often tend to focus too much on everything, every details, every features, but in order to recognize a subject, we usually need really few information. So the idea in here is focusing on this information, focusing on these main important features of your subject. For example, I just talked about this feather, and the idea that this way the feather can separate is a bit of a characteristic of the subject and can help to make it recognizable. So you can even work on it and train about it without painting, just trying to figure out what is important in this subject, how should you paint it so that everybody could recognize it. Identifying the kind of the fewer things required so that you can recognize a subject can lead you towards more freedom in painting it, because you know you have to have these features and the rest is just your painting style, your watercolor freedom, your dripping pigment and your splattering on your own choice of colors, these kind of things. So let's work on it. For example, this flower of hydrangea, which is special in this flower? That's not necessarily the color, because they can be really changing, not even the little nerves or something. I would say that just only a flower with 4 elements and just the little stem, maybe the thing in the middle. And you can also notice that there is this kind of shape between the petals that I can try to get. If you compare different kind of the same subject, you can more easily notice that the color is not the main thing, or even the shape of the petal can be a bit random, but what is defining it is this kind of 4 thing, and it creates a bit like a square, so this could be a bit special too. So a square-shaped flower with 4 petals, using a bit any color I want, and there is this kind of curvy shape in the middle. Could a bit of changing color. Trying to keep the square shape. And there is this kind of little shape in the middle, and maybe the stem. And then once again, while it's still wet, you can always refine a bit the sketches, or even if you like dropping some pigment in it. So once again, that's all about what is special in your subject. For example, maybe more the texture and the kind of thin outline in here and kind of sense of light. For this, for example, it would be to have a kind of 4 point in this sleeve, which has no point at the top but just a crease, so this would be the special thing for this subject. For this kind of dried flower, I would say what is special is it's so thin, so you would like to use a really thin brush, this one, or maybe my sword liner, to have this kind of sense of details. And whatever the shape, what would be important would be this sense of detail. What would define this shell would be a kind of round shape, but also some kind of lines in here and the other direction. So a bit like with my feather, you would try to get the spirit of it just with your brush. Maybe I can show you this. So I want to create a bit of a sense of detail like I did in my feather with this shell. By the way, I don't really talk about the color I use because it's not the point in here, so I don't want to disturb you with too much things. So you can try to start getting the right shape and then trying to get the impression of the texture by painting the subject in the right direction. Of course, at the same time, you could work with a sense of light, something. Or when we work in layer, we often, you know, don't work on everything at the same time, but maybe first is a bit of a kind of first color, and then here you could enhance a bit of the sense of the detail, but by another color, or giving a sense of light gradually. Here it is. The thing I wanted to address is when you draw a kind of subject like this without any shadow, they are a bit floating in the air, which can be okay. For example, some leaves like that, you can imagine that it's a bit floating in the wind, and why not even the feather. But if you want to anchor them to the page and giving the impression that they are, you know, put on something, you have to sketch a shadow. So you can have several strategies with a shadow. First could be waiting for it to dry and making a really light shadow by just you know, looking at how the shadow is on the real subject. I usually like to make them while it's still wet to have it a bit linked together with the subject, but it's slightly more tricky. But maybe making a difference of color, for example here picking some more blue shades could help to make the difference. And usually for the shadow you can work it a bit twice, which would mean now defining a bit the shadow under the shell. And in the case you would think that it's not enough separated, you could, when it's dry, maybe redefining kind of darker edge underneath the shell, for example. So this was about getting the spirit of the subject and not focusing on every feature, but really on the things that are going to be important in your subject. And now, before giving you some advices about how to refine your edges and painting them better, I want to address the fifth secret weapon, which is paint it imperfect. Maybe you noticed if you watched the previous video how imperfect my brushwork was when I painted these flowers, especially when shooting at the same time, which was a bit tricky. But you know, all these petals, they are not a kind of regular curves, they are just a bit, kind of odd shapes, and it works so well. And the thing is, if you paint them too regular, it doesn't work as well. This is negative painting, but it would be the same for positive painting. But if you paint things really regularly, kind of round petal, so I think this is supposed to have 5 petals. So we're going to talk about making negative painting easier out there. I struggle a bit to make such a regular shape like I wanted to make, but yeah, this is a bit the idea of what I wanted to show you. I don't know what you think, but for me this is not a real flower. It's more a kind of fairy tale flower, and you can just put a really lovely yellow dot in the middle, and that's just a kind of illustration, which is great. But if you want to paint and having a more painterly approach, that's better not to have such a perfect subject and having one of the petals bitten by a bug or something. So either you use the positive or the negative. Don't try at all to make it perfect. Just embrace kind of imperfection, make it a bit three-dimensional by making some petals smaller and some bigger, and this way you can have a bit of an impression of a flower, which will be really more realistic. So we didn't find out all our secret weapon yet, but I am wondering if some of you think that maybe this approach seems a bit simplistic or something, and I would say it's not. I rather think that it's a way to breaking down things so that you can understand that it seems easy, and that afterwards when you put everything together for more complex scenes, and yeah, you put the negative with the positive and the color variation and breaking shapes and silhouettes and sense of light, focusing on the important features, not painting your subject to perfect, kind of a childlike way. When you put everything together, you get the spirit of watercolor, in my opinion. For example, if you are considering this scene, which was a piece of a magazine tear sheets I got, you have in here a really obvious silhouette. So this simple silhouette with a plain, surface is just at the top of an outer wash. So this could be done with the first wash and then working with a silhouette like I just showed you. Another example from Mark book, if you look at some of his sketches, especially for example this one with the white sky, and he's talking about Cambodia, which was so wet he couldn't work in layer, but I like how this simplifies even more his approach. And this is just a work with a silhouette, just a bit broken like I did with the feather earlier in some points, just with a bit of color variation, but this is exactly what we are talking about and what I am trying to show you. And if you look the right way at the work of some great painter, for example here Alvaro Castagnet, look at this background, how he was able to simplify this shape so much so that you just have a simple silhouette and it's just working with a positive and a negative. Just a puzzle of several shapes, you know, interlocking shapes together, positive and the negative, and that's what makes the difference. That's how great painting I created. Look at this one. Alvaro added a few details on the silhouette, but most of it is just this kind of silhouette, and you put all your silhouette together, focusing on what is important, painting it not too perfect, you know, kind of see the broken edge in here, on all kind of softened or melted things. Here are a few other examples from the Hazel songbook, and she also encouraged you to explore with kind of just simple silhouettes, just separated subjects, focusing on something, and then at the end putting all together to make some more complex. But once again, before painting a bunch of flowers, you need to be able to paint just one, positive, negative. We are going to talk about negative shape, don't worry. And then at the end you are able maybe to paint some wonderful giraffes, just making a silhouette and maybe just afterwards dropping a few pigments when it's wet, or just a few things when it's dry. Just amazing all what we can do with just a few simple brush strokes and putting a few shapes together. And that's what I try to show you, a bit of the easy way if I can. Now that I told you that imperfect is better, I guess I can reveal the secret of straight and confident lines. That's all about how you use your brush. Practical advice! So let's say that you want to create an edge, maybe to paint this leaf for example, and that the edge is a bit like that. I am drawing to show you this time. So you pick some greens with your brush, and usually what you are going to do is probably holding your brush that way and trying to make the edge. The problem is because of the round brush, this is a bit too dark for you to see. Round brush, you know, if you change the pressure of the brush, I exaggerate it to show you, but this is going to create a really imperfect edge. So that's why sometimes when you paint, you have this kind of impression that you can't really get the edge really right. So the right way to do it, so that you don't have this problem of the round brush being, you know, more distant or closer to the... It's a bit the same problem if you try to make a line and it's not really regular. So this time I was holding my brush the same direction than the line, and this was a bit of the wrong thing to do. The better things to do if your subject is big enough is holding your brush at an angle regarding to the line and using it that way. I'm going just to paint this side so that I don't mess up my page. So when you hold your brush at an angle regarding to the edge you want to create, it's so much easier to get just the line and the edge you want. So once again, always think about laying down your brush and using it at an angle regarding to the edge you want to create. Here the little stem is a bit of red, so it can be fun to make it that way. Here I made a line to show you better, but without any line that's the same. You're always holding your brush at an angle regarding to the edge you are making. So sometimes one side is easier than one other, but you have to turn your hand so that you can have the right angle for your brush. once again a really simple silhouette that I can... Oh, it's dried so fast. And even with a bit of green. And that's it. Maybe dropping a bit of yellow too, to get the spirit of this leaf. Tip number 7, next secret weapon is really paying attention and working with the white of the paper. One of the main characteristics of watercolor is its transparency, which means that even if we have a few paints that are opaque, most of the time we use transparency of watercolor, which means that except for a few details or maybe to correct something, we are not using white or putting light colors at the top of darker colors, but this is a white of the paper, which is our white for our paintings. And also, in fact, the lighter the color is on your painting, the more the paper shows through, which means that this is why the paper shows through a lot, that this color is light in your painting. So this 7th tip is about getting a real watercolorist mindset, which is at the beginning of each painting wondering which has to stay white and which can be painted. And painters working in layers are going probably to have this question at each layer. There is always this question about what has to be painted and what has not to be painted. For our simplified approach with only one layer, and that's usually how I work, I recommend that you try to have this mindset about do I want to paint my subject as a positive silhouette, colorful, but then on a white background, or will I do the reverse? But if you start trying to paint a pink flower on a green background, your painting can suffer about a lack of contrast, because maybe you focus too much about color and not enough about contrast. But if you think about one thing is white, one thing is painted, this is a strong contrast, and this is how your painting is going to work the best. So yeah, try to think about what is going to be painted and what is not going to be painted, and with the painted area, try to create a kind of a big whole silhouette shape that works, which means that you have a nice outer edge and a kind of silhouette effect like we talked about earlier. Always work with a bold contrast, especially for your main subject. For example, if I am painting a view with a bell tower or something, like could be a bit that way, and maybe you have a few roof tops just beside and melting it in a one only wash, and a few antennas and chimneys. Here it is. So here I choose to make it darker on a white background. If this was painted, I would be the sky to be really light, because if not, the contrast would be too low. And we really want a high contrast, especially if this is our subject. On the contrary, if you decide to make it with negative painting, which means painting all around the subject but keeping the subject white or with the previous layer color, you are going to paint it all around that way. And this can really give a really striking presence to your subject too. And maybe a chimney in here. So you have to be quick enough so that your wash doesn't dry on you. Here it is. So if you decide to do it that way, I would recommend that you keep your buildings and the church white, or really, once again, with a really light wash, because once again it's a matter of contrast. So making a brown church on a dark blue sky is not a right choice. Always interpret the value and the color so that you have a strong contrast between your elements. For example, if I see a lovely house in the middle of the countryside, maybe the wall or the roof are a bit pinkish, but for sure the greenery all around may be darker than the house. Maybe there are some trees around, so I am going to keep the house white so that it can have a striking presence in the middle of the greenery, and maybe at the end you can add a really really light wash of something just to define the roof, a few things, but I would recommend once again that you keep it simpler possible and that you keep your white really clean and really crispy to get the more successful and interesting watercolors. So in this case, once again, I would have a kind of shape of the house. Maybe I could have made a chimney too, but this is it. And you can imagine some trees here all around. You want quite a dark color just beside the white so that it's striking and playing with a bit of texture. And in here maybe you have a field or some lawns or something. I think my house has a weird shape. Try to correct it. And so I said, maybe you just want to evoke a bit of the shadow under the roof in here. And something really subtle, but not much more. A lot of painters make this really light wash at the beginning and then work with a negative painting to define their light subject. As for me, I usually work on the white paper. Just do what works better for you. But once again, think about creating a huge contrast between your subject and the background. Don't you think it's cute? I hope it can be useful for you to see a bit how I think about my watercolors and how I do them technically. My secret weapon number 8 is called negative painting made easy. So we talked about negative painting, and it is about painting all around the subject to define usually a light subject thanks to a darker background. But this is not always easy to do, and a lot of you are telling me, oh, my brain doesn't seem to get it, and I just can't really have the right shape with a negative painting, plus painting with a brush is not so easy. So I want to introduce in here a kind of method so that you can work with negative painting, but that your brain is not messing up and you can manage to do it easier. For example, it seems a good idea to try to make it easier on this quite complex subject, which is this shell, but the shell is quite light, so I would like to imagine it on a darker background so that it really gives a sense of an impression of light. So the funny thing is, even if I plan to define the shell with negative painting, I am going to start with a silhouette, a positive shape silhouette, but with a really light wash. So I'm trying to define, this is not even light. Try to get it the lighter you can, really light wash. So I try to define it with the several parts together. This could be just slightly more pinkish orange because the shell is pinkish orange. So as you can tell, this is really light. And what you can try to do is trying not to define too much the top of the subject, trying to keep a bit of space at the top because the light is coming at the top and you're going to understand it quite soon why I recommend it. So try to make the subject as if it was a bit smaller at the top and you can define a bit better the bottom. So the idea is to give to your brain a bit of the image of the subject, of course, but without using a too strong and too dark wash, which would kill the contrast we were talking about just earlier. And now we are going to work on the negative painting, especially defining the lighter part of the subject at the top. So as the light comes usually from the top, or maybe the light is coming to the right, that's important that to this side where the light is coming or supposed to come, you're going to keep a trim of white in here. Keep always some white to make your subject shining, having a strong presence. You can tell that I am holding my brush at an angle regarding to the edge I try to create. Here it is, and if you don't want this kind of weird edge, you can sometimes just make a few random dry brush strokes like that. Or you can decide to soften your edge, which means you wash your brush to have just clean water, and you touch the edges so that it's soften on the white background as a variegated wash. Plus, you can even choose to define your subject with negative painting all around, or just keeping a bit of the negative painting effect to the lighter side, and maybe on the darker side it could rather be the shell that would be darker in some parts. It's a choice. You can do both. Sometimes the shell is going to have a bit of a shadow that is going to connect a bit the subject to the background. So now if I touch the subject, of course the edge is going to be a bit lost, but you can always define it a bit later. Be careful not to... Oh, just a minute, I want to soften this edge because this is a bit too strong. So I was saying, be careful not to keep a light trim, a white trim, the side. This is the shadow side, this is the light side. So when you work that way, you want to have a white trim on the light side, but not on the shadow side, because it doesn't really exist that you would have a light just in here. This is in shadow and the shadow is in here, and the light is the other side. And the other side I could work with a cast shadow, for example. So now my paper is wet, so that's a bit more complex to work on. So if you want to experiment with this kind of thing, you can just wait for it to dry and do it on dry paper if you are more at ease with it, of course. But try always to connect a bit your shadow with the subject so that both doesn't feel too separated. And now softening the shadow. So finally I kept the negative painting all around because the background is darker all around the subject than the subject itself. And so, this is it. You can just add a few lines if you like, but once again, don't break too much your negative painting effect, because it's so pretty that way. Oh, it seems that I painted my shell. So the negative painting made easy means that you paint first the subject with a really light wash, just defining its silhouette shapes, and that afterwards you paint it all around with a darker color with the negative painting, and especially keeping nevertheless some white at the top and on the light side. The tip number 9 is a way to think about more complex subjects. For example, the fern that I sketched a few days ago, and some people asked me to show them how I paint them, how I handle my brush strokes, and I was happy I was able to simplify it, so I am going to show you a bit how I did that and how I managed to make a loose watercolor successful painting with a kind of complex subjects like that. I guess this secret weapon number 9 could be called main shape, then details. And I am going to show you how it helped me for these ferns or for palm trees as well. In Portugal, I am probably going to sketch more palm trees. I don't know if in Porto there are some also. There are quite a lot in Algarve. So what helped me to paint these ferns was ignoring, at the beginning at least, this structure. I mean, if you consider that you have a whole leaf made of dozens of unities like that, and for each one you have to make dozens of little dashes like that, it can end up like a nightmare. So a better strategy is to work on the main shape and ignore the details. So to work on the main shape, it can be nice to have kind of the in the middle line, and then working on the leaf with keeping the brush stroke loose, but once again, what defines this subject is also this kind of outer edge. So the important is to try to have this sense of the leaf becoming bigger and bigger. Even if you simplify a lot each part. I try to use more water so that it doesn't seem too dark. Then, as I said from the beginning, with watercolor, the really great thing if you can correct your edge as you go. So in my sketch from the other day, sometimes I worked with some brush strokes a bit by the other direction to evoke this structure. Or sometimes you can just start with it and then connect it with a line at the other side. And right away you get the impression of the leaf. You know, the looser the better. This is almost a bit too strong or too regular, and as soon as you try to have just brush strokes, not even really connected like that, and this works so well for a loose evocation of something. And personally I like it that way, and the other day I kept the leaves quite a lot that way, but if you are someone who likes to put just slightly more detail, you can just go back afterwards, either when it's dry or when it's still wet, and giving this impression of kind of separate leaves. But once again, this is not really necessary, and the idea of ignoring some features to be able to paint a complex subject is the main point in here. And so I had this same kind of problem with the palm trees in South Portugal. I thought, oh, but if I start just painting each leaf with its special structure, I mean, you start wanting to paint leaves like that, and that they have something like that, and you have to make dozens of them, and yeah, that's just not sustainable. So here, once again, the strategy is just simplify each leaf to get the whole shape of the palm tree. Maybe for some you can make a bit of an impression of the structure, but not for all of them. Maybe another one in here, just impression. And of course you would have the trunk of the palm tree. And now that you have your structure, you can work on it if you like, and maybe adding a few bit of an impression of leaf. Once again, when it's wet, like I prefer usually to do, or waiting for it to dry. And on each of these shape, once dry, you could, if you like, draw the structure that way. I mean, you have the impression of the palm tree, and it's looser and more effective and less time consuming and more enjoyable than trying to make it the other way. And this idea of working with negative painting along with positive painting when it's not too dark, you can use it for some other example. For example, in here, if you imagine that the light is coming to the right, from the right, you could have some of bushes or something, and keeping some light to the right of the trunk. I don't know if it's dry or not. And not white at all to the left, because this would be the shadow side. And this way you just create an amazing impression of light for your palm tree. You can even add it a bit darker to the left. And that's it. Same in here for the fern sketch. When I did that the other day, I started just sketching the leaf individually with a positive shape, but at the end I wanted to have a bit of a hint of a background, so I added some darker color just a bit around the shape, but keeping some white to give a sense of light. So I can show you how I did it in here. So once again, the light is coming from the top, and you want to keep some light and just defining a bit it. As the ferns are quite horizontal, you could even, the light is coming a bit all around, and you could do that a bit all around. That's what I did the other day. Plus, if you want to evoke the structure of the leaf more closely, that's a bit what I did the other day, you can just, in some part, trying to paint this effect of how the leaf are structured. But once again, you do it with several steps, not focusing on it from the beginning and then adding this afterwards. And of course, it's tempting to make the negative painting all around. Oh, I could define my palm tree negative painting with my background too. But what I was saying is, finally, that's usually better to have kind of impression of lost edges in some parts and just defining them in a negative or positive way. Not everywhere, but just in some parts, so I could add just a bit of wash in here. And you could just imagine it in the other areas. Or just with a light wash like that.
We were lost. Love has found a way to leave. I won't give away. Live every day something real.
So finally, the technique of watercolor is quite simple when you break it down the things that way. Positive, negative, light, dark. Everything is about shapes, edges, values, and colors. But of course, that's quite a hard work to think about all of it all together and to make them work together with several subjects in more complex scenes. But once again, the best way to learn it is to start simple with a simple subject, just 1, 2, focusing and having a clear contrast approach, and then you will end up making more complex scenes like me more easily. And the last but not least secret weapon, the 10th, is stop sooner than later. It's so easy to overwork your watercolor by wanting to add some details and value and defining more, but what a shame to spoil that way the beauty of the first wash of watercolor, pure colors melting together. So keep it loose and unfinished the more you can, and stop sooner than later. I have 2 strategies to share to help you to stop the sooner possible. One is taking photo of step by step of your work. First of all, it's a nice way to record your process, so it's really interesting afterwards to watch at your step. Plus, sometimes it will make you realize, like for me, then you should have stopped at photo number 3 and that photo number 5 or 6 is quite a bit overworked, isn't it? But also, when you take a photo of your work, you create a kind of a little thumbnail from your work, and it's a kind of a step back, and suddenly you see your work a bit differently, so it can help at the moment when you take the photo. Maybe just to think, oh, it just needs some bit of contrast in here, and then that's maybe not perfect because you are not going to think that, but I am sure it is just perfect. So take this step back by making some photos and realizing that your work is done. There is nothing to add. And here is the second strategy. I know some of you are going to freak out if I talk about putting an alarm, but I do it for me sometimes, and I think this is really useful. The idea is not to make you rush, but maybe just realizing how much you can achieve just within maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, maybe for you it can be half an hour if you are usually a studio painter that is working on your piece for 2 hours. But by subtracting to your usual time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, maybe half an hour if you spend usually a really long time, this can help you just not to work on this last 10 minutes that are going to spoil your whole work. What I am doing usually is when I think I want to make a sketch within 15 minutes, for example, I put an alarm, maybe it can be 12 or 13 minutes, so that I know that when it rings, I just can't, keep going for a few minutes, just 1 or 2, and that's it. I stop. I really hope that my advices and a bit of my fun secret weapon at the same time about the mindset and also about kind of practical advices about how to do things can help you with your own practice. That's really thanks to these simple principles that I am doing my watercolor sketches. Remember that art and painting and watercolor are all interpretation of what you see, so you can make it white even if it's not, you can make it blue even if it's not, you can make it colorful even if it's is done, that's all your choice. Good luck everyone for the following of the 30 by 30 Direct Watercolor 2018 marathon, and if you watch this video afterwards, I hope this is going to help you to get looser with your watercolor and to enjoy the process even more. Feel free to subscribe for more watercolor gorgeousness and negative painting, and if you already subscribed, thank you so much for following the adventure. May the creative force be with you all, and see you soon! Bye! I think the shell is my favorite, but I quite like the other ones too.